In construction contract for private projects, the main contractor must guarantee the employer on his performance by both performance bond or retention fund. All the guarantees are for remedy the employer for the non-performance of the main contractor. In other words, if there is non-performance on the part of the main contractor, the employer can call upon the performance bond and use the money held as retention fund. Performance bond can be defined to mean a bond paid by a main contractor from a financial institution to guarantee his performance to the construction contract by way of a premium. The amount of the bond is equivalent to a 5% of the contract sum which agreed between the main contractor and the government or the employer. However, the bond is held by the financial institution until it is called by the government or the employer for non-performance of the main contractor or released or refunded to the main contractor upon his performance on practically completion of the project. Retention fund only for private project can be defined to mean a fund withheld from the main contractor from his interim payment work done plus materials on site to a trust account either virtually or as an escrow account by the employer. The sum withheld is calculated at 5% of the value work done plus materials on site on every interim payment, the same as in performance guarantee sum. If there is non-performance on the part of the main contractor, the employer can use the money withheld to remedy the non-performance part of the works. Contractual obligation. According to clause 30.5 in PAM 2018, the gross value of work done and the materials delivered as ascertained in the certificate is subjected to deduction for retention money. The percentage is determined by the employer and should be inserted by the employer in the appendix. Thus, if now stated in the appendix, consider the percentage is not exceeding 5% of accumulated value of works and material on site. An example here shows the deduction of retention money after times with the given 5% is 540,000 ringgit Malaysia from the calculation of total gross value of work executed. The contractual obligation between the employer and contractor regarding retention fund. In clause 30.6, the contractor has the right to ask the employer to keep the money in the trust account to be held by a stakeholder appointed by the contractor. Due to that, the employer must open the account within 14 days after the request. The arrangement is important to avoid problems, especially in the case of insolvency of the employer and the contractor. Next, the payment of retention fund. The retention money is released in two stages. Half of the amount so retained upon the issuance of the certificate of practical completion for the whole work which is within 14 days. The other half upon the issuance of certificate of completion of making good defects for the work which also within 14 days. Here is the example of the calculation of retention fund and payments in stages. For deduction of retention fund in the last regular progress payment, it is required the total payments to the contractor 2 million ringgit Malaysia to be deducted with 5% of retention fund. Thus, the contractor is paid 1 million ringgit Malaysia as 1 million ringgit Malaysia is retained as retention fund. For the release of retention fund upon issuance of certificate of practical completion, it is required the total payments to the contractor 1 million ringgit Malaysia to be deducted with 2.5% of retention fund. Thus, the contractor is paid 500,000 ringgit Malaysia as it is retained as retention fund. For the release of retention fund upon issuance of completion of making good defects, it is required the total payments to the contractor 500,000 ringgit Malaysia to be deducted with 5% of retention fund if any. Thus, the contractor is paid 500,000 ringgit Malaysia, meaning the whole amount 20 million ringgit Malaysia is returned to the contractor as no more money retained as retention fund. Here is another example of calculation of retention fund. According to clause 16.1 in PAM 2018, in the case of partial possession by the employer, the amount retained for the relevant part must be released when the section is occupied by the employer. The percentage of retention fund for the part is the same percentage used to determine the amount of retention part for the whole work. The first half of the amount retained released within 14 days after occupation of relevant part. For example, given here the value of retention money for the relevant part is 200,000 ringgit Malaysia, then will be divided to half, which is 100,000 ringgit Malaysia, as 2.5% is the value of relevant part. Thus, the new progress of retention money is 900,000 ringgit Malaysia. Meanwhile, the second half of the amount released on the issue of completion of making good defects of the relevant part within 14 days. The amount of retention fund is reduced for the contract by the total amount of the retention fund released. For example, the current progress value of retention money 1.5 million ringgit Malaysia shall be deducted with half amount retained and remaining amount retained. The retention money is divided to half, which is 100,000 ringgit Malaysia each, as 2.5% is the value of relevant part. Thus, the new progress of retention money is 1.3 million ringgit Malaysia.